Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a couple of seconds. We're just waiting for folks to join us in the Zoom meeting. Thank you. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriella. I'm co-chair of the Los Angeles Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you joining us today for this panel, Righting Wrongs, Truth and Healing for Indigenous Communities Through Law and Policy. ACS Los Angeles is committed to challenging and disrupting systemic oppression and structural inequality that continues to detrimentally impact our society as a whole, as well as the lives of historically marginalized communities in the United States, including Indigenous, Black, Immigrant, Latinx, and other communities. This commitment includes hosting a series of discussions that center the voices of advocates from these communities who are working on shaping equitable policy across various areas of our laws. These discussions also aim to share recommendations that you all as attendees can pursue in the movement for equity and justice. Today's discussion focuses on how law and policy can serve as tools for truth and healing for Indigenous communities across states, as well as in the new federal administration. I'd also like to quickly thank our co-sponsors. We've received a lot of amazing support for this event: the ACS Chicago chapter, Sacramento, Bay Area, Orange County chapter, the UCLA Law Native American Students Association, the DC Lawyer Chapter, Madison Lawyer Chapter, Austin Chapter, as well as the Mexican American Bar Association. Before introducing our incredible moderator and panelists, ACS Los Angeles would also like to acknowledge that our chapter engages in work on the land of the Tongva people. All right, so I'd now like to introduce our esteemed panelist and moderator. Our moderator today is Professor Angela Riley of the UCLA School of Law and director of UCLA's Native Nations Law and Policy Center and the school's joint degree program in Law and American Indian Studies. In 2003, she became the first woman justice of the Supreme Court of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. In 2010, she was elected as Chief Justice. She also serves as co-chair for the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Partnership Policy Board, which is a commitment to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'd now like to introduce Ambassador Keith Harper, who is a partner at Jenner & Block and the firm's chair of the Native American law practice. From 2014 until 2017, he served as the US Ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I'd finally like to introduce Julian Brave Noisecat, who works in journalism, policy, research, art, activism, and advocacy. He is the Vice President of Policy and Strategy with Data for Progress, Narrative Change Director at the National History Museum, and a Fellow at the Type Media Center, NDN Collective, and the Center for Humans and Nature. All right, Professor Riley, I will hand it to you.
Great, thank you very much, Gabriella, and thank you all for being here. I want to start by saying I am here in Los Angeles on the unceded land of the Tongva peoples, and I'm delighted to be able to be here today. I'm honored to be in the company of my friends and colleagues, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say today. I want to also thank the organizers, the ACS, and all the other partner orgs who have worked on putting this together. So let me just begin by giving a couple of remarks to sort of set the stage and also tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to be engaging in some dialogue with our two featured speakers here today, who I'm really honored to be in conversation with. And then towards the end of this presentation, we will be taking some questions. I think there's a function where you can submit those, and those will be monitored, I believe, through the Q&A by the ACS. And so we'll take some of those at the end. And then we're going to wrap up actually with some final words from our speakers. So that's what you can expect for the next approximate 53 minutes that we have together. I just wanted to start by saying, you know, as many of you are very much aware, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests in the United States and around the world, there has been at least movement towards a reckoning of the racial injustices that have occurred, you know, not only in this country, but in countries all across the globe. And part of that has been an acknowledgement and an increased focus on Indigenous rights. And we've seen that not only, you know, in the last 9 months, but even prior to that, with movements that have started in the US but have spread globally, like the protests and water protectors at Standing Rock, as well as a great deal of activism around sacred sites, extractive industry, and really calling for a time to to reckon with the history of this country in particular, and face the past that so many people are so woefully unaware of. So to that end, I wanted to start by framing this this conversation around the truth and reconciliation efforts. As many of you are aware, Governor Gavin Newsom here in California has recently initiated a Truth and Reconciliation Council to address the Indigenous history of California, which has not really been adequately told at all, and involves some really devastating practices, including genocidal practices, which have been documented in this state. And there have been similar efforts in other countries, including Canada. So I want to start actually by addressing my first question to Ambassador Harper, and just ask you to speak a little bit about what you think these kinds of efforts mean here in the United States. Are they merely symbolic? Do they have the opportunity to really advance healing and move racial justice forward? And what's your perception of the opportunities there?
Sure. Thanks, Angela, for the question, and thank you to ACS and the other partners on sponsoring this event. Look, I think that these efforts can be incredibly meaningful, and I think they can also not be very meaningful. And it really is highly dependent on the implementation. I will say this, that if we look around the world, so broadening the aperture a bit, we can see that conflicts often go in cyclical ways, and are in a cycle of often violence, and certainly cycles of oppression. And that can be broken when an appropriate process is there and implemented fairly and well, to bring communities across divides together. There has been, as you've mentioned, an extraordinarily awful history in California and for Native communities across the Americas. And that doesn't self-correct. That takes an asserted effort, because you have intergenerational things that continue to impact these communities. And so I guess to answer your question, we've got to find those things, and there's ways to do that, where they do lead to resetting the relationships in a much more positive direction, but also addressing the underlying ramifications of those past policies that inevitably exist. And so I don't think we can say one way or the other at this stage that it will work. But it is also, what we can say is that if we are going to have a brighter future, if we are going to self-correct, then this is a necessary precondition for that, and implemented well.
Well, great. Thank you for that. And if I could build off of that and turn to you, Julian, there have been efforts toward this end in Canada, particularly around the consequences of the boarding school policies, which of course affected not only Canada, but the US and other settler nations. Could you talk a little bit about how this process worked from your experience in Canada and what kind of results it either produced or you expect it to produce?
Absolutely, that's a great question. And first to start, I just want to say it's an honor to be on a panel with Professor Riley and Ambassador Harper. You know, I always feel a bit like maybe I shouldn't be on these panels because, you know, in many of our communities, we usually let our elders speak first, and I'm a little younger, as maybe you guys can tell, but it's an honor to be here, of course. I'll also say that it's nice to be on a panel located in California. My family is from the Secwepemc and St'át'imc First Nations in what is now British Columbia, Canada, but my father moved to the United States on little known provisions in the Jay Treaty that actually allow status Indians in Canada to live in the US. My dad's lived here for over 30 years on provisions in the Jay Treaty, and actually grew up in Oakland. And I'm having a bad hair day, so I'm wearing my Dubs hat today. So I know that this is an LA centric panel, and you know, people are probably Lakers fans or whatever, but Dubs, baby. All right, so to answer your question, You know, my grandmother is a survivor of the residential schools. The residential schools were purposeful assimilationist policy that has been described by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada as an act of cultural genocide. When they took my away to the residential school when she was 12 years old, they rolled onto the reserve in cattle trucks to take the kids away to the residential school. And the residential school that she was taken away to in Williams Lake, which was about 100 miles away, was a site of really horrifying abuse. There were actually priests and others who worked at the school who were later found to have committed dozens of acts of physical and sexual abuse against the students who went there. And so this is an incredibly scarring experience. And I think it's worth pointing out that this is also not like 100 years ago or 200 years ago experience. This was a living memory in my family. And, there's obviously in Canada, more visibility to this set of issues than there are in the United States. There was, of course, a policy in the United States of sending children to boarding schools. Actually, the Canadian policy was built off of the US policy in some ways. But there has not, of course, been the same sort of national reckoning with that history here in the United States as there has been in Canada and there is in Canada. Of course, now we have the Healing, Truth, and Reconciliation happening in California. It's worth pointing out that even in the history of colonization of North America, like the history in California is especially horrific. I grew up in Oakland, for example. The first people of the Bay Area are the Ohlone. They are not federally recognized. In the early 1900s, anthropology professor at UC Berkeley actually declared them extinct, which was not true at the time, but their population had thinned and they had to basically avoid the racism that existed against Indians in California at that time, had assimilated or hidden themselves as Latino and Hispanic to try to get through those really challenging times. And that's the history that we inherit. In Canada, I think that it's important to point out, because maybe we're headed there in the future here in the US. There's been a mixed response to Truth and Reconciliation among First Nations people. My Ke'a went to a big Truth and Reconciliation event in Vancouver a little over a decade ago. For her, it was an incredibly moving experience. It's, of course, incredibly moving for someone who has survived an act of cultural genocide like she survived, to have that history affirmed and to have, the people in power who perpetuated that wrongdoing, recognize it and say that they're going to take steps to reconcile. But at the same time, I think that there's a growing criticism that there's a lot of focus on the second part of the Truth and Reconciliation, right? The reconciling, without really actually still grappling with the truth. There are lots of unacknowledged truths that we need to really wrestle with before we can hurry up and get to that act of all right, well, we put this behind us. And very often my feeling is that we want to do these things so that we put them behind us, and maybe we don't need to put them behind us so quickly. I think that I hope that in the US we start to grapple with these histories in the same way. I'm glad that we are starting to in California, but I think we really need to be purposeful in what it means to, sit with that history, a history that says that, many people were driven to the brink of extinction through purposeful policies, through hundreds of years of policies, and, are still dealing with the legacy of that today.
Yeah, thank you for that. Not to oversell the goodness of Oklahoma, but to say a little bit about that, the contrast between being raised in Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma on a farm in Kiowa County, as compared to when I moved to California, the difference that with people's complete lack of understanding that there were tribes in California. There's over 100 federally recognized tribes in California. That history is really untold here. And that was a very stark contrast to me, although certainly we only get one version of that history in Oklahoma. I actually want to sort of take the Oklahoma point as a jumping off point to go to my next question, which is that we are, of course, in a new day. We have a new president, a new administration has been sworn in. There have been a lot of changes in the last 4 years in Indian policy between the Obama administration and the administration that followed. Keith Harper, you were actively involved, of course, in the Obama administration and have stayed actively engaged, as I understand, in many aspects of political mobilizing. And I just wonder if you would talk a little bit about that and the impact that natives have had on the last election in particular, but also what you see for political mobilization going forward. As one of my good friends said to me recently, the I in Indian is for independent. Indian people don't vote as a homogenous whole. We're not, decidedly one political party or another, because the issues that face us are very complex, and Indians are a very heterogeneous group. That said, Native people played a big role in this election, and particularly in some states like Arizona and New Mexico. So I'm curious to hear what you think about the future of political mobilizing in Indian country, and what that looks like for us in terms of maybe some degree of justice with regard to Indigenous issues.
No, it's a really important question. And I do think that we are at this moment when the exercise of political power, just in sheer numbers in certain states that are battleground type states, has given tribal communities a sort of weight that it did not have before. And to be candid about it, I mean, I'm a Democrat, but I'm also going to be very clear that there are those in the Republican Party like Tom Cole that have been stalwart supporters of tribal communities. Having said that, if you look at most recent administrations, the Obama-Biden administration was the most pro-tribal administration in the history of the nation. I mean, just going across the board from VAWA reauthorization to inclusion in programs like the Recovery Act, to the enhancement of budgets, to youth Indigenous programs, just soup to nuts, the take of into trust of Indian lands and the expansion of homelands, and frankly the engagement right through the Tribal Nations Conference and having senior advisors at the White House. And what we have learned from that experience is that you can then utilize that as a basis to build further political engagement. And I think that further political engagement is what made it a challenge not to appoint Deb Haaland as the Secretary Designate of the Department of Interior, because both of our increased political weight, but also our increased engagement in building off the record from prior times. So what we know now is that political engagement matters, and what that should do is inform us that if we are wanting to make advances on tribal policies, on ensuring tribal sovereignty is respected, ensuring that we can be free from state authority, and just the full panoply of issues that drive Indian country, the protection of our communities through enhanced jurisdiction, then it's going to take that political engagement. But what we know now is that we have established a means to actually achieve those aims. And so now if you look around the Department of Interior, for example, you have senior people that are Native in not just Native specific roles. You have them in other roles, in the head lawyer for Mineral Management Service, and the principal deputy solicitor, and of course the Secretary of Interior. And that's also true at the White House, where we have 4 natives who are in important positions there. And so it is incumbent on us to build on that progress. And I think that there are other places in the State Department and other departments in which we have we have to make ourselves heard, and also not be satisfied with half loaves when we deserve more. And increasingly, I think we're going to implement that because it works and it betters the communities across Indian country.
Great, thank you for that. And I really want to follow up with a few questions for you about our increased engagement internationally and elsewhere. But let me turn to Julian first to just talk a little bit more about, Julian, I know you've been very active in political mobilization in this last election and in general, and also with mobilization related to Deb Haaland and her hopefully confirmation as Secretary of Interior. So could you talk a little bit about your efforts? And I'm also really interested to hear, you made a comment at the beginning about elders speak first, and I'm assuming you were not referring to me or Ambassador Harper as elders, but with that in mind, that you are only slightly younger than us, I would also be interested in hearing your perspective of youth engagement. You know, as a professor, I engage a lot, obviously, with students who at this point are significantly younger than I am, and their take on things, their view on things is different than my generation. And in my view, it's a very positive take on things, and a very hopeful and optimistic view. But I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about youth engagement and political mobilization and what your experience has been with that in the last, couple of years in particular.
For the record, I've found a couple of gray hairs on my head like a year or two ago. So I guess my wisdom's starting to come in at the top of my temples. Let's see. So, I think that there is a lot of political mobilization in Indian country. Of course, the Trump era in many ways began with a very unusual story of Native people standing up in the path of a pipeline that the media didn't want to be a narrative, because the story was an election between a Clinton and the guy, who used to fire people on reality TV. But, we were so mobilized at that moment and so focused on our treaty rights and stopping the Dakota Access Pipeline that we, forced our way into the narrative, onto the front pages, right? And so I think that the question is not just like, whether Indian country is mobilized and uniquely mobilized, compared to historically or anything like that, but whether that mobilization is seen and recognized by the media, by the parties, by those in power. I think that actually in some ways is the more important question. And of course, I think that, a new generation of activists and a growing focus on activism in Indian country, folks like the combined organizer and comedian Dallas Goldtooth, and a huge community, a growing community of, activists across Indian country are a significant part of that story. I think though, I've, as someone who's done a fair amount of both, participation in that and then also writing about it, I think that when we are seen and when like our story becomes visible, I think it's actually a much more interesting and complicated story than people might even be aware of, just paying attention to things like, Standing Rock. So for example, this summer, the Supreme Court issued probably its most significant treaty rights decision in a generation in McGirt v. Oklahoma. And it was a Trump appointed Supreme Court justice who wrote the majority opinion. And it was in the middle of a summer of, uprisings about racial justice in the streets. And that story and the history that made it possible of, tribes not just working with Democrats, but also actually truthfully having pretty strong relationships across the aisle with Republicans is one that I think most people who pay attention to the history and the politics of diversity and race in this country might not actually be aware of, right? And this actually, to a certain extent, was part of the subcurrent of the efforts to make, Deb Haaland, Secretary Designate Haaland, the first Native Cabinet Secretary. And I think that here, there's a very unique window on our capacity as political strategists, as political leaders, and our ability to, both be people who are fighting for justice, but also have unusual allies. And one of the things that I think was really interesting about the effort to get Congresswoman Holland, now Secretary Designate Holland, nominated to be Biden's Secretary of Interior, was that it wasn't just, she's a progressive, she's a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, a bunch of progressive groups came out for her, the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Justice Democrats, the Sunrise Movement, that set of groups, came out for her. But we also got, and when I wrote a profile of her for Politico magazine, we got Don Young and Tom Cole to give quotes on the record, in support of her effort to become Secretary of the Interior. And I think that to this day, Deb Haaland might be the only American politician who can say that she has support of, the leftist groups like Justice Democrats and congressional Republicans, like Don Young. And I think that story, right, like that story of not just someone who can be a champion, a path breaker, but also a unifier, is one that's just widely not recognized, but clearly exists, in our communities. And I think that if nothing else, I think it's a really interesting story, and I do wish that more members of the political media and folks in power were paying attention to it, because it's obviously going places.
Well, thank you for that. And before I turn back to Ambassador Harper and do sort of pull back to a more kind of meta view, I want to stick with a couple of issues that I want both of you to address on domestic policy. So, one of the issues that's come up here is you speak about reaching across the aisle. Gorsuch, of course, wrote the McGirt opinion. He was elevated from the 10th Circuit. So he had spent time in the West. He had interactions with Indian tribes. One of the issues that I think we feel is a certain degree of just an enormous distance between many people who are being elevated to the higher levels of the judiciary who have very little experience with Indian country and with Indian tribes. And the more experience people have with tribes, it seems the more knowledge they make decisions from. And I think that's a really critical point for us all as well. But kind of building off of that, I just want to touch a little bit on the difficulty around issues of, domestic policy around extractive industry, for example. The very first executive order, as you note, that was signed by the former president was to open up the Dakota Access Pipeline. And one of the first that was signed by the current president was to stop the Keystone Pipeline. Not all Native people are on the same page with regard to extractive industry and with regard to, what kind of activities they want to see taking place on their own lands. So let me actually turn this to Ambassador Harper first. Could you just talk a little bit about the complexity of these issues where Native people might not all be similarly aligned, and perhaps some of the challenges this might be raising for people in the administration, including, Deb Haaland, among others?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is a complex area. There are certainly tribes, whether in coal mining, or oil and gas developments, that rely extensively on fossil fuels. And so, as we think about the absolutely essential shift just to address the climate crisis, we do need to think about how it impacts those communities, and frankly, not any communities that are similarly situated. And so I think part of the challenge with Washington is that we get into these camps where everything is really for political points, rather than trying to figure out collectively, what is a sensible approach to these issues, including things related to energy. And it's one of the reasons why I think Deb is such a excellent choice. She has demonstrated, I think she was rated the highest, the most effective legislator to work across the aisle in the Congress last term. So she has this record, and as Julian pointed out, it's one of the reasons why she has support of no raging liberal Don Young, and yet she's also got support among some of the most progressive members of the Democratic caucus. So in that person, we have somebody that has the capability and the demonstrated record of being able to bring communities together. And so what I hope happens is, whether it's with tribal communities or non-tribal communities, that we ask these questions about how do we make this important shift to move away over time from fossil fuels, while making sure that the communities that are specifically affected by that shift also have the kind of resources so that they are not devastated. And I think we can do that. And it has to be, though, with a person that can have the kind of leadership capabilities to bring people from across the ideological spectrum. And so that's why it seems to me that Deb is such an inspired choice by President Biden. You know, it's great that she's a Native woman, and I'm glad that we finally going to have a cabinet person that's Native. But even beyond that, it's that she's the right person for the job at this critical time.
Great, thank you for that. And Julian, if you want to say a few words about Deb Haaland as well, but let me also give you another question that I want to turn to. I want to make sure we have time to address a couple of other important things. One, of course, being COVID. So we know the pandemic has hit Native communities as hard or harder as any community in the United States. And the devastation on many of the reservations has been really quite profound. And I know you've been working on writing about this issue, I think particularly at Navajo Nation. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit in response to Ambassador Harper's point, and then also talk about the research and the work that you're doing on COVID and where you see that going in Indian country.
Yeah, let me see if I can handle those two things at once. So firstly, I would just say that Secretary-designate Haaland is a remarkable leader in a very, very holistic sense of that word. She was, in her class, objectively speaking, according to GovTrack, the most effective legislator in the last Congress, of House freshmen. And at the same time, she has an incredibly real and relatable story. I just think, not just for Indian country, in my opinion, I think for a broad, swath of Americans. She struggled with homelessness earlier in her life. She lived on food stamps. Her prior employment included stints as a cake decorator and a small salsa business entrepreneur. She was still paying off her student loans when she ran for Congress in 2018, and so was her daughter. This is a very just real person who, doesn't just have the policy chops and like leadership experience in like a narrow, DC like smoky backroom sense, but like in like a really like broad sense of like, being a very rounded person. And I don't know, I just find that really inspiring. And I think that at the end of the day, it was, her being who she is, and also just being incredibly generous and kind to people that, led folks like me to want to fight for her, right? Like I live in DC. I do some policy and political work in addition to like journalism stuff. And I won't just go out there and fight for anybody, right? And I think a lot of people felt that way, that they wanted to fight for her. So I think that that's really important. I think secondly, just to build on Ambassador Harper's points here, there's an immense amount of complexity and diversity in Indian country. There's 578 federally recognized American Indian, Alaska Native tribal communities across the country. That's a lot. There's a number of them, a minority, but a number who are, pretty, I don't want to say dependent, but, derive a significant portion of their revenues from fossil fuels. It's notable, for example, that the moratoria on drilling and leasing excludes tribal lands right now. And the administration, as I understand, and tribes have spoken up to the administration about, particularly the ones that rely on fossil fuels, about the importance of those revenues, to their functions of government, keeping the hospitals, making sure the schools are running, all that sort of stuff. At the same time, the story is a much more complicated one than, the usual story of fossil fuel communities. the Navajo Nation was coal country in many ways until 2018, and it voted 84% for Joe Biden in this election, right? That's a very different story than the one you hear about coal miners in West Virginia, for example. I think that that's notable. And it's interesting that when we talk about coal miners, we're not talking about, the Navajo Nation. We're not talking about, Crow and Northern Cheyenne in Bighorn County in Montana. And why is that we're not talking about those people? And then lastly, I think that there's just an immense tragedy that's unfolding right now in tribal communities. I've been reporting a story about the Navajo Nation for the past year, following two elderly Navajo people as they, survive this pandemic. At various moments, the Navajo Nation, which has a population density just slightly higher than that of Siberia, actually had more coronavirus cases per capita than the Hubei province in China, where the pandemic originated, the coronavirus originated. I think that data point really tells a really damning story about the just negligent, public health response on a federal scale, and in some cases on a state scale to this pandemic. And my friend and a former, Obama administration official, Jody Archambault, wrote a really moving op-ed in the New York Times about, who we are losing in this pandemic. And very often, it's our culture keepers, it's our knowledge keepers, it's our language speakers. And among my people, my nation has about 200 fluent speakers remaining. And my Kia is one of them. And, there's a coronavirus outbreak right now on our res. And, just thinking about what could be lost and is being lost at this moment is, I think it's really, really scary and tragic.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, I know one of the things that is tied to the way the pandemic has raged in Indian country is the chronic underfunding of the Indian Health Service. And I know that there is at least some optimism that we might be seeing some change in that in this next administration. Julian, I don't know if your research has turned up anything on that or anything you want to say on that point.
Yeah, there was, I forget what the data point was exactly, but it was something like we fund, each patient at IHS is funded a third of what we are spending per patient for Medicaid or something like that is the statistic. Basically if a budget represents a country's values and who it says matters, the gross misfunding of IHS, which often I think falls to Congress, but also, the Trump administration often talked about cutting that funding as well, is I think really illustrative of that. And what that meant at some moments was that, like, at the beginning of the pandemic on the Navajo Nation, for example, there was one bed for every 1,000 people or something like that. I have these numbers in my story. I can't remember them off the top of my head. But there was one bed for a huge number of people, on the reservation, which was actually, a smaller fraction than the number of beds per people in places like New York City. So, I think that, just again, to the point of your question, right? The infrastructure, and the history of why it's not there, despite in many instances, treaty promises that say by law it should be there, is just a really damning thing. And I just don't understand why, every Congress comes and it remains the same story.
Yeah, thank you. I want to take a minute before we run out of time. We have a little more time for more questions. And Ambassador Harper, I really want to take a minute to hear about where you see us going with international engagement. In the last 4 years, we saw the United States, pull out of numerous bodies that allowed the United States to engage internationally and have an externally facing sort of position in the world. And that really changed radically. And some of that seems to have already begun to shift course with the new administration. But some of those things relate directly, of course, to Indigenous rights. And as many of our viewers know, there are particular mechanisms at the United Nations level that engage specifically on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so I'm interested to hear what you see as what the new administration will mean, both in terms of Indigenous rights and more generally, to re-engage really with the global community.
It's a good question and quite appropriate at this juncture because, of course, President Biden gave a 20-minute speech yesterday addressing his view of foreign policy and national security. And I thought it was striking for how it really was thematically consistent with what America has said about its foreign policy for decades, except for the last 4 years. So we have to see really the last 4 years as a departure from what has gone on for decades. And, you know, we were in a situation with the Trump administration that it was far more apt to brutally criticize our closest allies in NATO than the brutal dictator like Kim Jong-un or the murderous dictator in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, or the Saudis' murder of a journalist. So I think what the marker was from yesterday was that we are going to, as in his words, we are back, and that we are going to turn back to the fundamentals and first principles of U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, I'm not Pollyannish of the view that the U.S. always gets it right internationally. However, I would say that when we are working well, when we let our diplomats do their job and we support that, we are a force for stability and security and ultimately prosperity. And I think that's where President Biden wants to get back to. And certainly Tony Blinken, who many of us worked with at State, is an excellent choice for Secretary of State, and I think will get us on the right track. With respect to Indigenous issues, you know, the last 4 years was just a stall in some ways. I mean, I think there had been, you know, sort of a crooked line of progress prior to that, with stemming from the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014, I think. But what I think that there are some specific things that can matter. One of those is to change the participation methodologies at the UN so that tribal nations as governments can participate rather than just NGOs, because I think that tilts it towards non-governmental bodies rather than, you know, sovereign entities. And then for the United States, what I'd like to see is a special envoy for Indigenous peoples' issues. When the State Department finds a particular issue really, really important, then what it will often do is appoint an ambassador at large or a special envoy. So you have one on, for example, what we call GWE, or global women's issues. There's one from the Obama administration on LGBTI rights. And it's just an indication by the United States, which has great weight around the world, that these issues are important. And not only that, then you have one office that then can participate in any kind of bilateral dialogue, which may raise, if there is a bilateral dialogue between the United States and Mexico, for example, or the United States and Canada, Indigenous issues should be on the table. And there should be an expert in the room that focuses on those issues, because we share a lot of the challenges and a lot of the obstacles. And so how do you address those? And in some ways, there are cross-border implications as well. So having that person at the State Department with an office would dramatically change. Well, would send a signal across the globe that will be powerful in and of itself, but also will have the effect of consolidating that office and making sure that it's always a presence, so that Indigenous people, you know, this is what happened when there was a senior advisor in the Obama administration at the White House within the Domestic Policy Council for the first time. And what that meant is no matter what the debate was, whether it's environment or education or healthcare, you had somebody that was aware of how that was going to implicate Indian country. And that's exactly what we need with respect to the international dialogue as well. And so that's why I think you need something like a special envoy, and it's time for it.
Well, let me follow up with you and ask you the hard question then. Do you think that that's a possibility in this administration? Do you think we could see that happen?
I haven't been involved in any specific conversations about it as far as with the administration. But I think that if, come Tribal Nations Conference time, if tribes were to make this a top agenda item, then I think, again, administrations tend to be responsive to the political will of the constituents. But I don't know if that's been done heretofore. And so to the extent that is done, then I think that there is a strong likelihood. I mean, look, the Biden administration is going to start from a position of trying to be pro-tribal, wanting to be pro-tribal. But exactly what the manifestations of that looks like, in part, is dependent on the relationship and dialogue with Indian country. So as that occurs, if this is something that emerges as a top item, I think it'll be given serious consideration.
Great, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Julian, let me go to you now. I think, you have a unique perspective in a couple of ways here. One is that, you of course have roots in Canada. So there's a sort of international, at least transnational perspective inherently. But also, I just think the Indigenous rights movement in general, especially among your generation, is global. And I think there is a commonality in a sense that Indigenous peoples are in it together. And there are issues that really go far beyond the borders of this country and even hemispherically. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on sort of how to think about an international human rights movement for Indigenous rights and where you see that headed.
Well, I just got more thoughts on that from Ambassador Harper. So let's see. I mean, so, since the League of Nations, when Chief Deskahey, traveled to the League of Nations and said that the Haudenosaunee should be seen as a nation, right? First Nations, irrespective of our, which side of the medicine line we're on, have viewed ourselves as sovereign and have insisted upon that, since we first encountered colonists. Among my First Nation, the Secwepemc, there was a very significant leader in the international Indigenous rights movement named George Manuel. He's since passed away a while back, and his son was also significant in that space. But I think that's an aspiration that exists across the U.S.-Canada border. It exists among Maori. It exists among First Nations in Australia. It exists among Indigenous peoples all over the world. And I think that one of the really interesting things about my generation today is that because of things like the internet, really, of new communications technologies, more and more people from this emergent transnational and really global Indigenous identity are able to connect with each other in significant ways to have cultural exchange of ideas. I remember vividly during the Standing Rock movement, videos of Maori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, doing the haka in support of the movement at Standing Rock. I went to the Native American Indigenous Studies Association conference back in 2019, and it was held, at the University of Waikato in Aotearoa in New Zealand, right? So I think that this is a really exciting, emergent, transnational, identity in many ways. It obviously has longstanding political traditions. I think it is increasingly culturally connected. It's intellectually connected. Obviously, as as a scholar, scholars of Indigenous studies are connecting across borders and citing each other's work and developing new and exciting ideas. And in many ways, I think that it's leveling major interventions in lots of different spaces, right? the way that indigenous sovereignty complicates notions of sovereignty in an old political theoretical sense, complicates notions of the nation state, right? The nation state being a place that is not a place of plurality in traditional sort of Westphalian thought is, I think, really significant, right? And I think actually is still and will have major impacts in the way that a broader humanity thinks about a lot of these challenges, particularly, I think, moving forward with climate change.
Great, thank you. Well, we haven't gotten a lot of questions in the Q&A, so we have about 6 minutes left, and I need to reserve 1 minute for the organizers. So I'm going to ask one final question that you can either answer or not, and give your final thoughts. So I guess as a final question, I'd be curious, and Ambassador Harper, this came up in our planning call. You actually made the point where we talked about what could happen and what should happen, and you said a lot of it depends on what does success look like to whoever's asking the question. What does success look like? If there is a successful administration on Indian policy in the next 4 years or global engagement, what does it look like? What does success look like to you and to you, Julian? And you can either answer that question or give your final thoughts in general in the last couple of minutes that we have.
I sitting here right now, I don't have a complete answer for what success looks like, but I think it would include some of the following. It would include ways for ensuring economic empowerment of communities that have been left behind, not just in Indian country, but throughout the United States, but certainly in Indian country, where there are places with 40, 50% unemployment rates. Because what that creates is disillusioned communities. And so I think if we're going to we cannot consider ourselves successful after 4 years if we haven't significantly addressed the economic impact. I would say also we're at a real critical stage on climate, and success has to include taking real steps, legitimate steps, both domestically and internationally, to turn the corner and head in a different direction. We have to do that while concentrating and ensuring that communities that rely on fossil fuels, as I mentioned earlier, are not further left behind. So these are intricate, challenging things. I think with respect to violence in Indian country, we've got to address, murdered and missing Indigenous women in a way that with far more robust and rigorous laws that empower tribes and fund tribes, frankly, with the necessary resources to address these issues, and reform the Department of Justice to ensure that it's a vehicle to ensure safety and security. That, when you undermine the women of any community, you basically undermine the community itself. And so if we don't, we're going to continue to have dysfunction unless we address that issue. So those to me are some key ones. I think that there are many more, but I'm also confident with so many responsible, forward-thinking people in the administration that at least tribal communities will have a partner in the next 4 years.
Great, thank you. Julian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'll just say that I obviously agree with everything that Ambassador Harper said. For me, success, I think that so often success for Native people has been defined as like just including us, right? And I think that we're at a point now where we're pushing beyond that, where it's not about, Native people being included and tribal nations being included, but actually being empowered to lead, right, in important ways. So in the Obama-Biden administration, that looked like someone like Keith Harper becoming an ambassador. In the Biden-Harris administration, that looks like someone like Deb Haaland, becoming a cabinet secretary. I think that that's obviously already a success story. But then I think on these issues that really matter, violence against women and against Native people more broadly, climate change, obviously a very important priority for the Biden administration, the response to the pandemic, I think that I would like to see us move from what does it mean to include, Native nations and Native people on these priorities to what does it look like to let Native people and nations lead in some ways on these priorities. And I think that can take you in lots of new and exciting directions.
Great, thank you for that. Well, to echo some of my own, mentors, Kevin Washburn, among others, the only policy that's ever really worked in Indian country is self-determination. And so I think that's exactly right, to see that empowerment and to address some of these grand issues that are bigger than Indigenous communities, but certainly impact us in unique ways in some circumstances. Well, I'm going to turn it over to our organizers, but let me just conclude myself by saying it's an honor to see you both and to be in conversation with you both. I am incredibly, gratified to be a lawyer and a professor and a Native woman in a community of people that is so committed and so forward-thinking and looking at these issues in such a critical and incredibly impressive way. So thank you both for your work. And Gabriella, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Riley. Thank you to Julie, and thank you to Ambassador Harper. This is such an important topic and conversation. Really appreciate you all for taking your time to participate in this with us. There was one question we didn't get to about steps to take to get a Truth and Reconciliation Council in other states. We will follow up to attendees with an email that has some resources to help with that, as well as a recording of this webinar. So with that, I will end this panel, and thank you again to everyone. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Jem, thank you.